It has been a while since I posted anything here. I decided to take a little break and think about what I actually want to do with my content. So, over the last 2 months, I have mostly been experimenting on Instagram, trying to understand what kind of content actually feels natural for me to make. So, I'm back and hopefully, I'll be able to make some new exciting videos here. Let's talk about the books that I read in January and February. The first book I tried to read was Under a Polestar, which unfortunately I had to DNF. The premise was actually very interesting. The story is set in the late 1800s and follows a young woman who's the daughter of a whaler. Somehow she manages to become a scientist and explorer working in the Arctic, but she constantly struggles to be taken seriously. There is also a male protagonist, an American geologist, and the book is supposed to be partly a love story set against this harsh and fascinating landscape, which sounds amazing in theory, but for some reason the execution just didn't work for me. After nearly 300 pages, I still didn't feel like I really knew the characters. The book also tries to explore the culture of indigenous communities in Greenland, which is an interesting perspective, but the narrative felt like it was trying to do too many things at once. Instead of feeling layered, it ended up feeling unfocused, so I eventually decided to put it down. After that, I read A Man Called Uwa, and I really enjoyed it. The main character, Uwa, has this very sharp and witty way of commenting on everyday bureaucracy and social absurdities. He's stubborn, deeply principled, and misunderstood by the people around him. But beneath all that rigidity, there is a lot of loneliness and quiet grief. The story is surprisingly warm and heartfelt, and it slowly reveals how small acts of kindness can reconnect people to each other. I also recently watched a speech by Frederick Bachman where he talked about creative anxiety and procrastination. And it was so funny, and it actually made me want to read more of his work, so I'm really looking forward to picking Anxious People soon. After that, I finally finished reading The Master and Margarita. I have accepted that magical realism is usually not my favorite. It just doesn't work for me, but this book was something else entirely. The premise is wonderfully strange. Satan arrives in Soviet Russia in a society where most people insist that neither God nor the devil exists, and of course, chaos follows. And what I loved about this book was the way its absurdity exposes the absurdity of conformity. Characters keep on denying the obvious truth, and how, even if reality keeps on slapping them across their faces, they won't wake up. The novel feels chaotic, surreal, and sometimes completely ridiculous, but underneath that humor, there's a sharp critique of hypocrisy, censorship, and social fear. And I believe that this is definitely one of those books that becomes richer on rereading, and I'm sure I'll come back to it someday. And while reading this book, I also watched this interesting podcast. One of the guests was talking about how, despite the restriction on speech, humans will find a way to creatively output their thoughts and truths. And it kind of also makes you wonder, why do we really need the truth? Why do we need freedom of speech? I also finished Sapiens. It's a very ambitious book that tries to explain the development of human societies from a very broad historical perspective, mostly Western one, and at times it can feel overwhelming because it tries to cover so many topics in the limited page number that it has. But I still think it works well as a starting point for thinking about how systems work, how systems, beliefs, and institutions develop. It's not a perfect book, and some of its arguments are debated, but what it does very well is raising interesting questions, and it reminded me how small individual uncertainty really is, how fragile many of the stories we build our lives around can be. One of the books I enjoyed the most recently was Catabasis. My reading experience was definitely enhanced because I read Inferno beforehand, because it made me think about how different writers imagine hell and what those visions say about their time. In Dante's cosmology, hell reflects a world where morality is believed to be fixed and absolute. Inferno is filled with souls who refuse repentance, while purgatory is filled with the ones who accept their failures and seek purification. Paradise represents alignment with the divine good. Dante's hell is terrifying because the people inside it never truly change. Even when suffering, many of them continue to justify their actions. Their punishment becomes a reflection of moral stubbornness, and it also kind of tells us about the time that Dante was living in. and he definitely included the people that didn't like. So we can say that Dante kind of wrote Inferno from a place where he was betrayed and exiled from his land. And I won't go into the things which I don't agree with since it's a product of its time. But talking about Catabasis, Kwang's vision of hell in this book feels very different. Instead of punishing sins, her hell interrogates justification. It is structured almost like academia itself. Pride becomes a library, desire becomes a student center, and the deeper the character descend, the more hell begins to resemble systems that humans themselves have built. In one of the most fascinating ideas in the novel, every soul must write a dissertation explaining not just what they did in life, but why they did it. Hell doesn't want confession, it wants truth. And most souls cannot bear to confront that truth honestly. What makes this interpretation interesting is that the greatest fear in this world isn't punishment, it's being wrong. Both Dante and Kwang ask the same fundamental question: what happens when humans refuse to confront themselves honestly? Maybe hell simply evolves alongside us. Once it was imagined as a place that punishes those who sinned, now it may be a place that forces us to confront the stories we tell ourselves. I also read The Kite Runner, and emotionally I'm fine, but my eyes definitely were not. This was my second Khalid Hosseini novel after Thousand Splendid Suns, and I loved it as much. What I appreciate about Hosseini's writing is the warmth that brings to his character, while still acknowledging the painful realities of the world that they inhabit. Her story helps filling this incomplete image many of us carry about Afghanistan, a place often reduced to headlines about war and conflict. And this made me kind of go into this rabbit hole of watching several traveling vlogs where the traveler went to Afghanistan and he was able to meet people. I definitely recommend watching them because it kind of fills in that image that this book tries to fill in. And I also want to say that through these vlogs and his writing, we see not only suffering but also resilience, love, and the complicated humanity of people trying to survive in difficult circumstances. Another book I finished recently was Patel. Although the novel is inspired by a real crime case, it doesn't feel like a crime story. Instead, it becomes a psychological exploration of loneliness, desire, and human connection. Through the relationship between the journalist Rika and the convicted woman Manako Kaji, the novel examines how isolation shapes the way people understand themselves and others. Food becomes the central language through which these emotional states are explored. Butter itself becomes a symbol of unapologetic desire and authenticity. Unlike margarine, which is artificial, butter represents indulgence and honesty about one's appetite. But the novel also shows how desire without mutual responsibility can become destructive. By the end, the story moves away from food as a symbol of isolation and toward food as a symbol of connection. As we can see what type of role food plays in both of these characters' lives parallelly, and Rika begins to understand that cooking and eating are not about control or performance, but about care, both for herself and for others. I finally finished the Miss Bond trilogy. I read The Well of Ascension and The Hero of Ages. For 4 days, I almost did nothing except read these 2 books. And this trilogy was honestly brilliant. The magic system is one of the most interesting parts of the series. It feels logical, structured, with a clear source of power grounding the fantastical element. But what really stayed with me were the questions the story asks. What happens when the hero fails? What happens to the world that was supposed to be saved? The series also explores ideas about belief, faith, and the human need to search for meaning. In this world, prophecies are manipulated, religions are constructed and rewritten, and the divine authority is constantly misunderstood. And yet, people still believe, people hope, and people still choose to fight for a better future. And I always find it fascinating how fantasy stories, despite their imagined worlds, keep circling back to the same questions we quietly ask ourselves about our own lives. If you have read any of these books, I'd love to know what you thought of them. Hopefully, I'll see you again in the next video.